Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be talking about something that's causing some waves in the dental world,
Yeah.
and that is the global shift towards mercury-free dentistry.
Mm-hmm.
Got a whole stack of research and articles here,
Right.
and it turns out that 43 countries have already banned dental amalgam outright.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing. And, I think when you think about that number of countries, taking such a strong stance on it, it really does, point to a pretty significant shift, both in how we think about things as practitioners and, the patient's perspective, too.
Absolutely. And for those who aren't up on this material,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about dental amalgam, we're talking about those silver fillings, the ones
Yeah.
that have been used for generations.
Mm-hmm.
And the key issue here is that amalgam contains mercury.
Yeah, and that's really the heart of the issue, and the potential health and environmental impacts that mercury has are really what's driving this push for mercury-free dentistry.
Now, it's not just about outright bans.
Right.
The research here shows that countries are getting pretty creative with how they're approaching this.
Mm-hmm.
Some have total bans. Some are phasing out amalgam in public health programs.
Right.
Others have specific regulations for vulnerable groups like children and pregnant women.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty fascinating to see all the different approaches they're taking.
It is, and I think that variety probably comes from a bunch of different things, including just the science that's out there, public pressure, and just the economic realities for dental practices as well, and even just cultural attitudes towards different materials.
Let's dive into some specific examples here.
Sure.
The research highlights several countries that have gone completely mercury-free.
Right.
And some of them might even surprise you. I mean, you've got, kind of your usual suspects.
Right.
Your Swedens, your Norways.
Mm-hmm.
But then you've got countries like the Arab states of the Persian Gulf.
Right.
The Philippines.
Yeah.
Even Russia.
Uh-huh.
Places you might not think of when you think of, progressive dental policy.
Right. And I think the fact that, you have countries from all different, political systems and priorities that are sort of, united on this issue, I think it really does, underscore that this is truly a global movement.
Absolutely.
And of course we have to talk about the EU.
Oh, yeah.
They've taken a really, comprehensive and decisive approach to this.
I was just about to get to that. I mean, their strategy is pretty impressive.
It is. They've taken a kind of a multi-pronged approach. So they banned it for children, pregnant women, breastfeeding women.
Right.
Recognizing that, those groups are, particularly susceptible to mercury exposure. But then they went further and they banned exports. They're phasing out production and import, by 2026. And they're even looking at maybe completely eliminating medical exemptions by 2029.
That's pretty big, especially considering that medical exemptions often allow for the continued use of amalgam.
Mm-hmm.
So it really does seem to suggest that they're committed to eventually getting rid of it completely.
Yeah. And I think, the EU's actions really do send a strong message to the rest of the world that they really take this issue seriously.
So with all these countries taking action, where does that leave the U.S.?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, especially for a lot of us in the dental field, right? The U.S. hasn't implemented any kind of nationwide bans yet, although, it's worth noting that some individual states have taken their own, steps. But, the key thing to remember is that the U.S. is a signatory to the Minamata Convention on Mercury.
Yes, the Minamata Convention. Can you remind our listeners what that is all about?
Sure, yeah. The Minamata Convention is a global treaty that's specifically designed to protect human health and the environment from the harmful effects of mercury. And it, sets targets for reducing mercury use and, emissions and releases.
And it's relevant to our discussion here because
dentistry is one of the key areas that the convention addresses, and it specifically encourages signatories to phase down the use of dental amalgam. Especially for those vulnerable populations we talked about earlier.
Okay, so even though the U.S. hasn't implemented any sweeping bans yet, being part of this convention means they're under some obligation to eventually, you know, align their policies with the convention's goals.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that the U.S. is facing more and more pressure to, move towards mercury-free dentistry, both from these international bodies and from within its own borders as well.
And this is where things get really interesting for dentists and patients,
Hmm.
especially in the U.S., who might still be seeing amalgam, used in their dental offices.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, it's really a crucial time for for the dental community in the U.S. to, to have those conversations, those open and honest conversations about what the future of, amalgam looks like. And we need to consider the science. We need to consider the potential risks and benefits. We need to look at the alternatives that are out there.
And these conversations, they need to include patients.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about empowering people to make informed choices about their own dental care.
Right. Patients have a right to know what materials are being used and to ask questions about, what the alternatives might be. They should be comfortable, talking to their dentists about these concerns.
This whole idea of shared decision making.
Yeah.
It's something that we're seeing more and more of across healthcare in general.
Mm,
It's about moving away from that kind of paternalistic model
right.
to something that's much more, collaborative,
Yeah.
where patients are really active participants in their own health journeys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Informed consent and patient autonomy are absolutely essential. Especially when we're talking about procedures that could have, both immediate and long-term implications for their health.
Let's talk about those implications for a moment.
Sure. So when we're talking about, the potential, health concerns associated with mercury, it's really important to understand that the primary route of exposure from, dental amalgam is through inhalation
Oh.
of mercury vapor.
So it's not just about ingesting it, it's about the vapor that's released from the amalgam itself.
Exactly. And while the levels of mercury vapor that are released are generally considered to be, low, there's a lot of, debate and research going on about, what the potential long-term effects are of that kind of chronic low-level exposure.
And that's where things get a little more nuanced, right? Because
Yeah.
there's not a clear consensus on exactly, what the risk is from amalgam fillings.
Right. And the scientific community, I think, is still, working to really fully understand, what those potential health effects are from this chronic mercury exposure. And there are a lot of, different opinions and interpretations out there.
And that's why it's so important for patients to have access to accurate information
Mm,
so they can really weigh the risks and
yeah.
benefits
Right.
of amalgam fillings against those alternatives that are out there.
Yeah. I totally agree. Informed decision making really does depend on having good information and making sure it's presented in a way that's understandable and not, overly sensationalized.
Right. It's about striking that balance,
Yeah.
between being cautious, but also, following the evidence that we have.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be mindful of the potential risks without unnecessarily alarming people.
Right. It's about giving, both dentists and patients the tools they need and the knowledge they need to make the choices that are right for them.
Absolutely. And that's where that whole risk benefit analysis comes in.
Right.
It's not just about, is there mercury there or not?
Yeah.
It's about what's the overall impact going to be,
Right.
on the person's health.
So let's dive into that benefit side of things a little bit. I mean, amalgam has been the go-to filling material
Mm.
for decades,
Right.
and there's got to be some good reasons for that longevity, right?
For sure. Amalgam has really proven itself to be, very durable,
Uh-huh.
long-lasting,
Right.
cost-effective, and it's also relatively easy to place,
Mm-hmm.
which is a big plus in some situations, especially when you think about, things like access to care and the economic realities of a lot of dental practices.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in a lot of parts of the world, amalgam really is, still the most practical option,
Mhm.
especially for patients who might not have access to, more expensive alternatives.
Right. So it's a complicated issue,
Yeah.
no easy answers.
Uh-huh.
And it's important to consider, all the different angles.
Mm-hmm.
But for listeners out there who are concerned about mercury
Right.
and are looking for alternatives,
Mm-hmm.
what are their options?
Well, the good news is that dentistry has, come a long way,
Yeah.
and there are some excellent mercury-free alternatives out there now, like composite resins and glass ionomers.
Yeah, I've heard of those. The composite resins are the tooth-colored fillings, right?
That's right. Yeah. So they're made of a mixture of plastic and glass particles, and they have some advantages over amalgam.
Well, like, the fact that they're tooth-colored, no more metal mouth smiles.
Exactly. I mean, aesthetics are huge for a lot of people, right?
Mhm.
And composites can, really give you that seamless, natural-looking restoration. But it's more than just, looks.
Ooh, tell me more.
Okay, so composites also bond directly to the tooth structure,
Hmm.
and that can actually help, strengthen the tooth and prevent, further damage. And because there's, no metal involved, there's no risk of, those galvanic reactions or metal sensitivity that you can sometimes get with amalgam fillings.
Okay, so it sounds like composites, they kind of tick all the boxes. You've got aesthetics, you've got strength, you've got biocompatibility.
Hmm.
What about glass ionomers? Where do they fit in?
So glass ionomers are another type of mercury-free filling material that has become pretty popular, recently. And they're made from a combination of glass and acrylic, and they've got some really unique, properties that make them really good for certain situations.
Like what?
Well, one of the big ones is that glass ionomers actually release fluoride,
Oh,
which can help protect the tooth from decay. So, we often use them in pediatric dentistry for that reason.
it's interesting. So they're not just filling the cavity; they're actually, actively helping to prevent, further decay.
Exactly. And because they bond, chemically to the tooth structure, they can provide a really good seal.
Hmm.
And that helps, minimize the risk of leakage and recurrent decay.
Okay, so we've got composites, for aesthetics and strength.
Hmm.
We've got glass ionomers for fluoride release and sealing.
Right.
Sounds like there's a mercury-free option out there for pretty much any situation.
Yeah. And I think that's really, one of the great things about all the advances in, dental material. Hmm.
It's given us so many more choices to meet, everybody's needs.
Right. But all these options, I mean, it kind of begs the question of, how do you choose? How do you know what's best for each patient?
Right. Yeah. The choice of filling material is definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
You have to think about, things like the size of the cavity, where it is, the patient's overall oral health, what their preferences are, and of course, budget is always a factor.
And this is where the dentist's expertise really comes in, right? I mean,
Right.
it's about guiding the patient through that decision-making process and really, figuring out what makes the most sense for their specific situation. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's also a chance, for dentists to really educate their patients about about the different materials that are out there and explain, what the pros and cons are of each one and really, answer any question they might have.
Right. It all comes back to that shared decision making, right?
Yeah.
That
Mhm.
open communication and trust
Yeah.
between the dentist and the patient.
Absolutely. When patients feel like they're in the loop and they understand what's going on, they're much more likely to be, happy with their treatment and to take good care of their teeth in the long run.
So we've talked about this global shift towards mercury-free dentistry.
Mhm.
We've talked about the reasons for it, the alternatives that are out there, the challenges and opportunities for dentists, the importance of, patient education and shared decision making.
Right.
But let's focus in on the U.S. for a minute.
Sure.
What's the current situation here?
Well, the U.S. is still kind of in this transition phase, I would
Yeah.
say. As we said earlier, there are no federal bans on amalgam yet. Although, it's worth noting that the FDA has issued some some recommendations regarding amalgam use in certain
Well,
populations.
can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So back in 2020, the FDA updated its recommendations, advising against the use of amalgam in pregnant women and young children, kids under 6, and that was mainly due to concerns about the potential neurodevelopmental effects of mercury exposure.
Okay. So even though there's no, outright ban,
Yeah.
there is this growing awareness of
Yeah.
the need to protect these vulnerable groups,
Hmm.
from potential mercury exposure.
Right, and I think those FDA recommendations were a really important step in that direction, and it's really gotten a lot of dentists thinking about alternatives to amalgam, even for patients who aren't specifically covered by those recommendations.
It sounds like things are changing,
Hmm.
Maybe not as fast as in some of the parts of the world,
Right.
but it's definitely moving.
Yeah. And I think, we have to acknowledge that change takes time, especially in a system you know, as big and complicated as the US healthcare
But
system.
there are people, there are organizations out there that are really pushing for change,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah. For sure. There are, lots of advocacy groups, professional organizations, researchers, who are really dedicated to promoting mercury-free dentistry in the U.S. They're raising awareness, they're educating the public, and they're trying to influence policy changes.
It's good to see that there's that, that groundswell of support for this movement,
Mm-hmm.
both from within the dental profession
Well,
and from patients.
yeah. And I think it just shows you that change often, starts from the bottom up with individuals who really care about making a difference.
But systemic change is important too, right? I mean,
Mhm.
we need policies in place.
Mm.
We need regulations that really support this transition.
Absolutely. We need policies that incentivize the use of these mercury-free alternatives that support research and development of new materials and that provide support for dentists who are making that switch. Those are the things that are going to really drive widespread adoption.
And what about dental education? I mean, how are dental schools preparing the next generation of dentists for this changing landscape?
Yeah, that's a really key question. Dental schools have a responsibility to make sure that their graduates, have the knowledge and the skills that they need to practice mercury-free dentistry.
Right. And that means teaching them about, the latest research on mercury, how to handle it properly, how to dispose of it safely,
Hmm.
and giving them that hands-on experience with all the alternative materials that are out
Well,
there.
exactly. We need a new generation of dentists who are comfortable and competent working with these mercury-free options,
Hmm.
and that starts in dental school.
It feels like there are a lot of moving parts to this whole transition.
Hmm.
It's not just about, swapping out one filling material for another.
Right.
It's really about a fundamental shift in how we think about dental care.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. It's about embracing a more, holistic approach to dentistry, one that puts the patient at the center and really prioritizes both their oral health and their overall well-being.
And the shift towards mercury-free dentistry is just one part of that, right?
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that oral health is connected to overall health,
Yeah.
that our environment plays a role,
Yep.
and that people really need to be able to make those informed choices,
Right. Right.
about their own
Yeah.
care.
Yeah. It's an interesting time to be in dentistry, that's for sure.
Mm,
We're seeing this real paradigm shift happening, and it's up to us to embrace it.
right. It's about moving beyond just, the traditional boundaries of what we think of as dentistry,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and recognizing that we have this responsibility to be advocates
Right.
for our patients' health and well-being in the broadest sense.
Absolutely. We have to stay informed. We have to keep those conversations going, and we have to work together to create a future for dentistry that is both safe and sustainable.
It really feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we really have. There's so much more to unpack, like we could talk about the specifics of the Minamata Convention. We could talk about, the economic impacts of switching to mercury-free practices.
And what about the research?
Yeah.
What are some of the big questions that scientists are still trying to answer when it comes to mercury in dentistry?
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot we don't know. We need more long-term studies, to really understand the effects of that chronic low-level mercury exposure from amalgam fillings.
Right.
And we need to keep, testing and refining those alternative materials,
Right.
making sure they're holding up well over time.
Hmm.
And then there's the whole issue of, how do we handle and dispose of dental mercury in a way that's environmentally sound.
Right. I mean, it's a really a dynamic field.
It is.
And this whole shift towards mercury-free dentistry, I think it's driving a lot of that innovation.
For sure. It's pushing us to come up with new materials, new techniques, new approaches that are better for everyone,
Hmm.
for our patients and for the planet.
So we've talked about a lot today. The global movement, the reasons behind it, the alternatives that are available, the challenges and opportunities for dentists, the importance of patient education and shared decision making. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a final question to think about.
Okay. Yeah, this whole discussion really brings up a really crucial question about the future of dentistry, I think.
And that is, how will this global shift towards mercury-free dentistry, how will that affect how we train new dentists? How will dental schools need to adapt their curricula, to make sure that graduates are fully prepared to practice mercury-free dentistry?
That's a great question. And it really highlights how important it is for dentists to keep learning,
Hmm.
throughout their careers. I mean, the field is constantly changing. There's always something new. And it's our job to stay on top of it all,
Absolutely.
for the sake of our patients.
And that goes for our listeners too, right?
No, absolutely. We encourage everyone to do their research, to ask their dentists questions, and to really be involved in their own oral health care decisions. The more you know, the better equipped you are to make good choices about your health.
Well said. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of mercury-free dentistry. Thanks for joining us today.